You're watching How to Be a Better Human. I'm your host, Chris Duffy, and I love my job. I feel so lucky that I get to interview interesting, intelligent people about their work and that you watch. That is incredible to me. I'm so grateful. And yet today's guest, Sarah Jaffe, the author of Work Won't Love You Back, Sarah argues that a lot of times when we have jobs that feel really good, where we like the people we work with and it feels meaningful, those are the jobs that burn us out the most because we end up feeling like we have to give everything to work, that we never leave any parts of ourselves for the parts of our lives that don't make money. So what does it mean to actually find a work-life balance? What does it mean to define your life, not just in how you make money and how you pay your bills? We're going to be talking about that, and we're going to be talking about so much more, everything from the aftermath of the pandemic to what happens when an entire industry is disrupted to what it means to grieve. We're talking about all of that and so much more with Sarah Jaffe.
I'm Sarah Jaffe. I'm a journalist and the author of, among other things, Work Won't Love You Back, How Devotion to Our Jobs Keeps Us Exploited, Exhausted, and Alone, and From the Ashes, Grief and Revolution in a World on Fire.
Let's start by talking about your book, Work Won't Love You Back. You've done a lot of jobs. You've done a lot of jobs that are service jobs. And then, of course, now you're a journalist. So you've kind of been on both sides where you work for yourself in a more creative way and trying to cobble things together. And then you've also been one where you're very much interacting with the general public. The title of your book kind of says it all, right? Work Won't Love You Back. Can you tell us about how you arrived at that conclusion and why it's important to realize that?
Yeah, I think really like you hit the nail on the head there, which is I went from all of the service industry work that I more or less hated to, oh, this is exciting. This is my dream job. I'm a journalist now. I went to grad school, I did the whole thing, redid my life. And my working conditions weren't that much better. And it, as I joke on my website bio, like I didn't make more money at first when I was a journalist. And so realizing that there was a lot in common there. And actually, I will tell people all the time that waiting tables is great training for journalism because you have to be able to sort of keep a straight face no matter what someone says to you. It's a really useful skill, and being able to talk to people and like smooth things over when feathers get ruffled. Like all of these things that I learned waiting tables actually have stood me in great stead as a reporter for the last 16, 17 years. But that sense that like, oh, I'm not, my life hasn't changed as much as I thought it was going to. I am still struggling to pay the bills. I was living in New York City when I started work as a full-time journalist, which like, yeah. That understanding that like, oh, like this is cool and I'm glad I'm doing this. And, don't get me wrong, I do not want to return to restaurant work. But recognizing that at the end of the day, work is still work and we are still doing it at the end of the day because we've got to pay the rent, not because we just like woke up that morning and decided that slinging sushi to tourists in Denver would be great fun.
When I think about it in my own personal life, I often think that like school is such a clear, it's such a clear system, right? Like whether it works or not for you, it's like we are doing work on this topic and there will be a test on this day. And if you get enough of the questions right, you get this quote unquote good grade. And it feels like one of the really important pieces of the conversation that you have started with Work Won't Love You Back is that maybe the approval and the sense of worth should actually not be coming from the place that is paying you money.
Like at the end of the day, I need to have other things that give me meaning and give me validation and give me the sense of doing something important in the world. And like, look, I still do the work that I do, which like, let me tell you, there are many subjects that I could cover as a journalist that would pay better and have more job security than being a labor reporter. But I keep doing it because I think it's important. I talk to a lot of nurses. I talk to a lot of teachers. I talk to a lot of people who are in these kinds of jobs where they are doing it because there is meaning in it for them. And we would want that, right? I don't want my nurse or my doctor to like only be in it for the money, right? There is that sense that like, oh, I get why we want that. You want your kid's teacher to be engaged and care about kids, right? I would be a terrible teacher because small children terrify me. And again, when you think about doctors and nurses, it makes sense, right? I would like the hospital to be run by the people who know about providing healthcare rather than the people who know about, counting budget numbers.
I think it's really hard if you're doing work that is like you said, a nurse, or you're working at a nonprofit that's fighting to clean up the environment, or you are working on cancer research, right? Like these things where it's like you are doing something that is so important. And I'm sure it is extremely meaningful. And maybe having a little bit more of a sense of like, we can be agitating for a better world and we can push for better conditions rather than just thinking like, well, I have to take it as it is because this is the dream job or whatever.
Yeah.
I think that's a really different way of thinking about work than many of us have.
Yeah. The place that I started that I think really got me, going down this particular front was the Chicago Teachers Union. In 2012, they went on the strike that was this first big teacher strike in the U.S. in a long time. And the argument that they made was our working conditions are our students' learning conditions. And it was this really great way of it now labor scholars and organizers call it bargaining for the common good. And what they're saying is that actually, if we are given better working conditions, if we are paid enough to actually live near the school that we teach in, if we have smaller class sizes, if there's toilet paper, I mean, they were literally bargaining to get toilet paper in the bathrooms on the first day of school. Like that's the kind of stuff they had to fight for. And so they sort of demonstrated their worth to the community by going on strike, which is the classic sort of labor tactic. But they also really had this innovative argument that was saying to people, you want our conditions to be better because it's actually good for everyone. And the same thing is true of these nurses that I've been covering, nurses at University Medical Center in New Orleans, it used to be Charity Hospital, but its purpose to be an open access hospital that serves everyone regardless of your ability to pay, that's been folded into University Medical Center. And these nurses are fighting and they've unionized and they're planning now their third strike because they're still not getting what they want.
This is where we can also bridge the line between the two books, because you draw a line between people who worked in coal mines and people who were working in care work, and how for the coal miners, striking was very difficult, but in some ways the care workers struggled more with the emotional side of striking because they didn't want to leave the people they were taking care of, even though the conditions were unbearable.
Yeah, Kevin. Oh my goodness, Kevin. I love him so much. So Kevin was a former miner in England, and he had been, a coal miner through the 1984-85 strike, after which Margaret Thatcher basically crushed the British coal industry. And this had been nationalized. So in England, right, the government owned the mines. So they were striking against the government, not just some faceless, mine boss. And, they lost. They got crushed. And a lot of them had to go into different industries. And not a lot of the men, for somewhat obvious reasons, went into care work. He's this big guy who had been working down a mine for, decades. And then the mine shuts down and he goes into care. And he's working with adult men who have various special needs. And you think about it, right? Because a lot of the people who do care work are my size. And I'm literally the average size woman. I'm 5'4" and 130 something pounds. If I have to restrain or lift or physically interact with somebody who's a lot bigger than me, I'm going to hurt myself. A guy who's 6'1" and has been working down a coal mine really does bring something else to that work that there are reasons to have a big dude do that work sometimes. But also he really loved it. And he found it meaningful in a totally different way than the coal mine had been. But as you said, the conditions still sucked. And he was sort of more used to going on strike than a lot of the people that he worked with. And again, a lot of the women that he worked with, because the coal mines were literally all men. It was illegal for women to work down the mines. So that whole thing, he was like, okay, I'm ready to go on strike. But a lot of the other people were like, oh, this is really hard for me because, we don't want to walk away from our patients because they need us. The boss is the one screwing us over, not our patients, right?
I also thought that a really moving piece of Kevin's story is that Kevin's experience of being in a coal mine with a labor union involved a lot of really caring for other people, for the men that he was down there with in a dangerous situation, and knowing that you could trust people and that they had your back, even if the bosses or the organization didn't. And that actually was a directly transferable skill to caring for people, because it was, in some ways, the union was care work. It was just care work that they hadn't thought of in that way.
Exactly. It was so striking, right, to talk to him and also to talk to Chris Kiten, who is the head of the union now, and mostly his job, because actually they closed down the last coal mine in Britain between when I finished writing this book and when we're talking. And so there are literally no active members of the National Union of Mine Workers anymore. There are just retirees and people who have gone into other industries. And so when I talked to Chris Kiten, so much of his job was he's either fighting for retiree benefits and healthcare and things, where they have, lung disease and things like that from going down in coal mines and breathing that air. And then he's going to commemorations and celebrations, but a lot of commemorations of mine disasters, because there are a lot of horrible things happened over the years, over the centuries, really, of the British coal mining industry. And so it really struck me that, like, this man who is, the leader of a coal miners union, his job is care. His job is fighting for these, his members' health care, and his job is commemorating, it's grieving, right? It's commemorating the disasters and the people that were lost. And that was really true of the practice of solidarity, of being down the mine, where it didn't matter if you like the guy next to you. If the wall starts to cave in, you're going to grab him and get the hell out of there. And then when I thought about, when you talked about the sort of entire social world of the miners outside of the mine that was built by the union. So the union had the miners' welfare hall, which was where you would go have a beer after work with your buddies. And it was where you would have your wedding, and it was where your children would be, christened or baptized, or I don't know, I'm Jewish. And like that space, right, that social space, all of that is what went away when the mines went away. What they miss is having a job that had some sense of purpose and having a decent wage that you could actually, maybe send your kid to college so they didn't have to go down the mine. And to have that kind of social life that was built in these places around the mines, because the mines are not in the center of a big city, right? They're in rural Appalachia in the US. They're in the north of England. The destruction of that entire way of life means these towns are just, they're wiped out. And one of the things that, to bring this back to care work, the first monument that I saw to COVID workers, right, was in Barnsley, which is the same place that the headquarters of the Mine Workers Union was in the north of England. And I don't think that's an accident, because they're used to commemorating workplace disasters. And COVID was, among other things, a workplace disaster.
When I was teaching in an elementary school, it's never like I was like politically right wing, but I realized that I had some ideas about unions that ended up changing, because I was working at a charter school without a union. I didn't like choose the school because of that. I just chose it because that's where I could get a job. But when I was working there, I believed like, oh, well, the union would just hold us back. It would just like protect the worst teachers. And over time, I came to understand that like there's all these structural forces at play. Right. And there's all these reasons why this job is really hard. And there's all these reasons why these kids are struggling or not struggling. Yeah. And having an organized piece where we all were in it together would actually be like a dramatic thing, even if this particular building didn't need it. That it's like, it's a broader thing than just that.
Right. Yeah. And it's so funny, right? Because the story that we were told about teachers' unions, right? I remember hearing that growing up. They just protect all the bad teachers and the rubber room myth and all that stuff, right? And like the charter schools are going to be better because they make it easier to fire the teachers. Well, like then you look around at, and again, I live in New Orleans, which like our school district has one directly operated public school, and it opened last year. But since Katrina, otherwise it's been 100% charters. And like the results haven't gotten any better. But what you have is just a lot of turnover instead. I worked in a nonprofit very briefly with kids who are like 9, 10, 11 years old. And like, oh my God, they're exhausting. They're amazing. They're exhausting. Teaching is hard. It gets better, like most skills do, over time. So you don't want to just like turn it over with like the new smart kid from this week who probably has zero patience with the kids. Like you actually get better over time. And so protecting your ability to get better over time is really important. But also, like where are there's places where you're having conversations with other teachers so you can say to them like, hey man, I had a really rough day this Tuesday. And like this happened with this kid and I don't know what to do. Can you help me out? Those structures too are part of what the union does, right?
This may be a kind of a question that you don't get that often, I think, which is like the kind of practical service journalism side of this, which is like, like a person is listening to this, or they've read your book and they're thinking about their own relationship to work differently, to their job. What are 3 things that someone should do to start to reevaluate the way that they think about work in general and their own relationship to it?
So the first thing I always say is like, talk to people. What do your coworkers think? How is everybody feeling about the job? Is it just you? It's probably not just you. Also, don't use your workplace email to do that. That's my number one bit of service journalism is if you're talking about organizing, don't do it on your work email or the work Slack. Find out, get people's phone numbers, use Signal, use a protected app, something else. But those conversations, they are the building blocks of everything that comes next, right? If you are thinking about organizing, you can also reach out to an organization, a union in your field, depending on what that is, and they can tell you what the rules are. For instance, you don't officially have to, if you are in the US, be a member of a union in order to have your collective rights on the job protected. So you have the right under US labor law to organize and talk with and advocate for better conditions on the job with your coworkers, whether or not you're in a union. This is something that I jokingly call the Newsies Rule from, the Disney movie musical where he goes, if we strike, then we're a union.
If we go on strike, then we are a union, right?
American labor law basically says that's true. And then, think about what your demands are and then what leverage you have to meet those demands. The thing that's true in a lot of these labors of love jobs, right, is that the boss will say to you, there are 20 other people just outside the door who would love to have your job. And that might even be true. Might be less true than they think. But we are in a somewhat tight labor market, but mostly still, the good jobs are still hard to find. Most of the jobs in the economy still are those, waitressing jobs that I was doing. So these questions of leverage are actually really important and interesting right now. It's not so simple as just get all your buddies and walk off the job. Sometimes it's easier to stay on the job and you can sit down on the job. You can do a work to rule action, which is where you do your job exactly to every possible last little rule in your job description, which turns out the boss never actually wants because they want you to be doing so much more. And you probably know how to do your job way better.
You talk in From the Ashes about grief, both personal, professional, and societal. And I think that a lot of us of a certain age feel like a form of grief or sadness or regret at not being able to have this kind of collective experience that it seems like existed in the past. My dad worked for the Port Authority.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say that he was ever what my passion is helping manage toll collectors. I think he would, but the idea that he could come in and do a job and have a pension at the end of his career and he would know that he was taken care of. Yeah. And he took a lot of pride in doing a job well and being a good steward of public funds.
Right.
For me and certainly for people who are younger than me, the idea that you would be at one job for 30 years is so the exception and not the rule.
We're living through this moment where the public sector is just being demonized. And it's also really interesting because I think people are starting to realize that that's wrong. Part of what's happening and part of what the folks I've been talking to a lot at the Federal Unionist Network and others, they're really making a defense of the idea of the public good. The idea that there are jobs at the Port Authority, that there are jobs at the Park Service, that there are jobs at the Army Corps of Engineers. I live in New Orleans. Again, I would like the Army Corps of Engineers to still be well-staffed, please, because they keep us above water. You take a pay cut when you work in the public sector, right? You don't make as much money if you are an engineer with the Army Corps of Engineers as you could out in the private sector somewhere. But you do it because you believe in the idea of the public sector. You believe in the idea that, these are things we should do for the public good. Again, to go back to those nurses in New Orleans at University Medical Center, they are saying, we want to work in this kind of public hospital, this kind of open access hospital, because we believe everybody should be able to get care. What would it look like to actually say that, we want to run the world for the good of all of us, rather than the good of Elon Musk getting richer? The good of everybody who drives a car or takes a train or a boat in the New York Port Authority or New Jersey or?
Yeah, New York and New Jersey.
New York and New Jersey, right. So everybody who takes the Staten Island Ferry, which is one of my favorite public institutions. I love the Staten Island Ferry. It's free and you can get a beer on it. Wouldn't that be amazing if we had more public transit that was free and you could buy a beer on it? Maybe not everybody needs to buy a beer on it, but still.
This idea that we have tried efficiency and productivity, I think a really new idea I got from the Ashes was the idea of the way that grief works in our personal life how it's not linear. It comes in waves. It's circular. Sometimes it's incredibly intense, and then it goes away almost entirely, and then it comes back. And how that personal grief can actually be, in some ways, a roadmap for societal and communal ways of thinking about progress and of thinking about dealing with problems, that it doesn't have to just be this straight, incredibly efficient line from we are at A, which is bad, and we're going to B, which is good. That's not how it works. For people who haven't read the book, just to start. From the Ashes is, and please tell me if I'm wrong, but it is both the story of you grieving your father who passed away, and it is a story of COVID-19 and deindustrialization and racism and societal failures. It combines the really big macro problems and the incredibly specific personal issues that you were dealing with. For people who haven't read that, how and why did you choose to do that?
It's a lot, right? I think we will all lose people who are close to us. People will die. People will leave our lives for a variety of reasons. A lot of us will lose jobs, homes. We all went through the trauma of COVID-19, although in different ways, and experienced it differently. And to sort of go through this moment of grieving, and my father died in 2018. So, it's been 7 years now. And to look around at the stories that I was covering and the work that I was doing and realize there's grief everywhere. And I had lost people. I lost my grandparents. I had certainly had my heart broken before, but losing a parent was something totally different. And it was so destabilizing and so transformative. And suddenly everywhere I looked, there was grief. And also I was trying to find things to read because I'm a nerd and I wanted to get an A in grieving the way I want to get an A in everything. And so I was looking for what do I read? What do I study? What do I whatever? And nothing really captured what I was feeling. And so on some level, I wrote the book that I needed to read. The way I deal with everything is to write about it. And this one has been harder to metabolize than most. It's been hard to talk about. Doing press for this book has been rough. It's been challenging to return to those feelings over and over again, but because they returned for me anyway. We just passed the anniversary of my father's death, and it's always around that time. His birthday was March 2nd and he died on April 2nd. So that month, I know it's coming for me. But it also comes for me at other moments. It comes for me in, moments that I won't even know what's going on, and I'll sort of be, and then I'm like, oh, it's just, okay, that's what's happening. That's there. And that sense that it's not just an easy thing to get over. It suddenly made sense when I was doing stories on factory closures. In 2018 was Trump 1.0, and I was doing a lot of stories on factories closing. I had been in Indiana, I had been in Ohio. Actually, the story is in the book where I was in Ohio. I was covering the closure of the Lordstown plant, which is kind of a famous auto plant, General Motors plant, just outside Youngstown, Ohio. And I was sitting in the office talking to Tim O'Hara, who was at the time the vice president of the union. And Dave Green, who was the president of the union, is now the regional director for the UAW in that area. He just comes in and flops on the couch and looks over at me and goes, how they say there's 7 stages of grieving? Well, we can't go through them because we don't know. We're stuck in the middle, And I was like, right. This is a grief story. Except it's a sort of disenfranchised grief is one of the terms for things like that, right? Where you can't really go through it because it wasn't clear what was actually going to happen to the factory. It has closed now since some of the workers are now working for a battery plant in the area. Some of the workers got scattered all over the country. But at the time, they didn't know. It was still early, and they were still trying to fight to keep it open. And to realize I'm already writing grief stories. I'm writing stories of immigration and talking to people about what they leave behind. Then 2020 hits and we get COVID, and then we get the George Floyd uprising, and we just get this double whammy of talking about grief in public, right? And whenever we say Black Lives Matter and we say, say their names, we're talking about grieving. We're talking about, that George Floyd should still be here, that Breonna Taylor should still be here. I when I was working on the book, I talked to sort of therapists and clinicians and practitioners about grief and about how they deal with it and how they help people deal with it. And so these are, where I sort of learn these terms. And disenfranchised grief is again, a grief that can't be acknowledged, a grief that isn't recognized. People are carrying around a lot of unacknowledged pain. And that comes out, if we're lucky, it comes out in ways that, are just sort of messy. If we're really not lucky, it gets toxic and it can destroy your relationships. It can destroy your grip on reality. It can destroy all sorts of things. It can destroy your health, right? It was so shocking to me how physical grieving was. Again, talking to clinicians and people, it was like, yeah, like I see people with like flare-ups of autoimmune conditions when they're grieving, like all of these things happen. And we just have no place for it for the most part in sort of late capitalist society, right? We just sort of are supposed to get back to work.
You say in the book that grief does not happen on the clock of capitalism, that's not how it works. So just to read it, it's many languages have a middle voice which is less concerned with agency. In the middle, the subject does not do or have something done to them. Neither can they simply opt out from or reverse the action of which they are a part. They undergo change while engaged in interactive processes from which they cannot simply withdraw. They are not and cannot be exterior to the process. And then you say, you are grieving, but grieving is also doing you.
Yeah.
That really hit me in the gut. The idea of it is both you doing it and it doing you. And it is active and passive and both. That messiness of grief, I think, is what a lot of people really struggle with.
Yeah.
And that struggle with not being able to articulate.
I joked about wanting to get an A in grieving, but like, it's really true. Like I was like, I'm going to be good at this. I'm going to go to therapy. I'm going to do the thing. I'm going to like get over it in record time and I'm going to be good at grieving. And like, oh no, that's not how that works. That is so not how that works. In fact, the more you try to do that, the more you're going to screw yourself up, I think. And to be willing to like allow it to happen on the clock that it happens at, it is, it was easier for me in a way because I work from home. I'm freelance. I had plenty of work I had to do, but I could kind of do it on my own time. So if in the middle of the day I needed to take a break and just cry for an hour, I could go do that. That sense, of like some degree of freedom that I had, which most people don't have, right? If you're going to work at the GM factory and you gotta, do the same thing all day long and you're, lifting up the thing and drilling a hole or putting a screw in or attaching a door or attaching a steering wheel or any number of things you might be doing on an assembly line, you just got to do that. And you can't pause the line so that you can cry. And you can maybe cry while you're attaching the steering wheels, but you might screw it up. So you probably don't want to do that. And also you probably don't want everybody to watch you while you cry, while you try to attach a steering wheel on the assembly line while the cars are going by you. Yeah, that middle voice, it was from a piece that was sent to me by the author Namwale Serpell, who wrote this beautiful book, The Furrows, about grief. And it made me think about a lot of things that aren't work in that way. They aren't sort of volitional in that same way. And this is where I get really corny for a second, but like, I also think that love is kind of like this. It happens in the middle voice. I would sort of think like I have to be actively doing things all the time. And one of the things that grief sort of taught me is that I don't become unlovable because I need things for a while from people. And I'm not always capable of immediately reciprocating. Like when my father died, the people who knew what to say and what to do were people who had lost a parent. And they reached out to me and were like, I heard your father died. I'm sorry. Some people would be like kind of gallows humor about it and say, welcome to the Dead Dads Club. But it was people who had already been there. And so sort of by definition, they didn't need me to do it back. So the only way that I could reciprocate was to reciprocate to other people. So it was to build it out in that way. So that when I had friends in the months, weeks, years after my father died who lost somebody, I'm really annoying with this with people in my life, actually. I'm like, not to be relentlessly on brand, but you're grieving, honey, and not just deaths, but also you lost a job. Also, you moved across an ocean. Also, you had a really bad breakup. You got divorced, and I will be that person who's just like, it's grief. And Here's what you will probably need at some point, and, what can I do? But also asking what I can do is kind of not helpful because you probably don't know what I can do. So I'm going to offer, I'm going to make you breakfast. I'm going to make you cookies. I'm going to come over and drag you out of the house and make you go for a walk. I'm just going to text and be like, here's a very silly meme that made me laugh. Here's a picture of a cute dog.
I want to read two quotes from the book that are from really different parts. One is from the kind of towards the very end, and the other's towards the beginning. This first one is from towards the end. This is why I think I cannot stomach the grief platitudes industry. Grief is not joyful or peaceful. It is a war inside me. It is an alien chewing its way out. It is a tornado somewhere beneath my lungs. It is breaking me, and somehow people can't see. I want them to see, and I am terrified they will see, and I am both of these things at the same time, being pulled in opposite directions like there's a team of horses attached to each end, except somehow unbelievably I am stronger than the teams of horses, and I do not get torn apart. That is such a unbelievably accurate description of grief to me.
Yeah.
And yet so incredibly specific.
Yeah.
And that's the personal side of grief.
Yeah.
And then I just want to pair it with something you wrote at the beginning of the book, which is the societal piece of grief and the social movements, which is, you say, I've covered social movements for the better part of 2 decades. And one thing that the ones that had stuck had in common was that they provided solidarity in a material way. They offered care that was physical. Food, a place to sleep, masks and hand sanitizer during COVID-19. They offered life even when protesting a death. We lack a word in English for this kind of life-making, like the missing middle voice. I've struggled in writing this book with the need for such a word, one that encapsulates the kind of world I want to live in and the way I want to live in it. It does not exist, I think, because we are not there yet. And to me, those two quotes really capture so much of the beauty of this book, and also the thread that I had never seen someone else draw between that intense personal suffering and the way that we can find a path forward together, that it isn't something you solve on your own, that it is actually something you solve in community.
Yeah. Yeah, I would not have gotten through the last 6-7 years without the people who love me. And I was very bad at asking for help. I'm still pretty bad at asking for help, but I'm getting better. The last talk that I did for it in public, my interlocutor was somebody who loves me very much and who literally held my hand through the conversation, and those moments where I had to realize that this is part of it, that one of those 2 people who squished me between them in the back of the car, I was apologizing for being a mess and needing to sleep on her couch. And she was just like, that's what friends are for, And I hear that in her voice still whenever I'm, sort of being difficult to myself. It's just like, oh, right. This is what we build these relationships for, is to be there. And, I am honored when those people call on me in those moments too, that I want to be able to show up as much as they showed up for me. And I want to be able to pay that outward to new people who haven't had to show up for me that way yet. And that's what makes living in this screwed up world worth doing, and that's also what gives us the energy and the power not only to change it, but to believe we can change it, right? To believe that actually we're better than the worst things that we're told about each other. One of the federal workers that I was talking to, Colin Smalley, he's with the Army Corps of Engineers. And, he was saying that these attacks on the federal workforce are attacks on the entire idea that we should care about each other as humans. And the way that we have organized that care in this world is through government. And it's a little bit more complicated than that, obviously. But I still do think what would it be like, again, to organize a world around making sure everybody is cared for in that way? And not just because those people have worked really hard at building up good personal social networks, but because we all deserve it. And we deserve that time off when we need it, and we deserve to rest when we need it, and we deserve to be fed when we don't have the energy to cook for ourselves. And just these basic things that we can do, as a world, as a society, we can make sure that everybody is cared for.
Anyone who has been through grief and through suffering understands that one of the things that it does, and you say this explicitly, is that it just erodes your ability to take bullshit. You have zero capacity for like the way things are, for people saying like, what's going on? Nothing much. You know, like you can't do that.
Yeah. Jewish tradition teaches that when every life is a world, right? So the end of every life is a whole world ending. And so when you have to imagine the end of your personal world, somebody that close to you that is gone, that you can't sort of just go through the world in the same way. At first, you can't imagine anything, right? But then slowly, it's like, oh, well, I have to imagine everything anew anyway. And maybe in that space, there's a possibility of imagining it better.
Sarah Jaffe, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you. It's been great.